I am just going to briefly share with you a little more information about the Cities with Refugees campaign and how this relates to today's topic of whole of society approach, or really engaging different actors in the protection of persons of concern who are asylum seekers, refugees, stateless persons, and persons at risk of statelessness. Next slide, please. So just to give everybody a brief background, the Cities with Refugees campaign is a global campaign that was launched by UNHCR in advance of World Refugee Day. Basically, this campaign aims to highlight the efforts of local governments or local leaders in creating socially inclusive communities where refugees are able to live in safety and dignity, become self-reliant, and contribute to their host communities or their local communities. As Attorney Dave mentioned, this is a significant campaign, not just for UNHCR in the Philippines, but other operations as well, because in most situations now, most of the refugees are actually located in urban areas, meaning there are only select camps. There are still refugee camps, but the world's refugee population are largely located in urban settings or in cities, like in the Philippines. So, you may walk around the city, you might see foreigners, no? Akala mo mga expat lang sila or people who have decided to take up residence, no, in countries. But in most situations, no, refugees are among us. Yung asylum seekers are among us. And such is the case, no, in the Philippines. In the Philippines, we don't have refugee camps. In fact, the refugee camps that we previously had, no, in Palawan and Bataan have closed in the early 1990s. And since then, no, since the Department of Justice has taken on the role of processing applications for for asylum or stateless status, no. What we have now in the Philippines are urban refugees. So meaning refugees, asylum seekers, and stateless persons, even in the Philippines, are located in different regions of the Philippines. So as far as Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao, they are among us. They are residing in cities, and just like every other Filipino, no, have needs or require access to social services. And this is why this campaign is important to UNHCR, particularly also within the context of the Philippines, to ensure, no, that all of our persons of concern have immediate access to rights and protective services. It's important to note then, no, that our persons of concern are not exactly as well off. No? Iba-iba yung socio-economic standing nila, iba-iba yung vulnerabilities nila. So especially, no, for those residing, for example, outside of Metro Manila, who do not have immediate access, for example, to the services of the DILG at the national level, or DSWD or DOH at the national level, mahalaga po yung role ng mga LGUs, ng mga local governments, or even regional offices, no, ng government, in making sure that wherever these persons of concern are in the Philippines, whatever province they may be residing in, meron silang immediate access to the services and protection of the government. So yung campaign natin, no, since we launched in 2018, to date, we have a total of 13 cities and municipalities who have signified their support to their campaign. And hopefully, no, with more and more developments in the protection framework, especially following the issuance of the DILG Memorandum Circular on the protection of persons of concern, we hope, no, that more cities will be able to support this campaign to ensure, no, that more of our persons of concern, regardless of whether they are in the Philippines, no, will have access to services and assistance, even in times of public emergencies such as COVID or even natural calamities, kung may mga typhoons or earthquakes and so on. So next slide, please. So on your screen, these are just some of the statements, no, that the mayors have given to signify their support for persons of concern. And it's really important, particularly in engaging local government services, to have leaders that are supportive of the local integration of persons of concern, because one of the things we have to consider, no, is that these are people who are coming from different cultural backgrounds, different ethnicities, from different religious backgrounds even. And it's quite different, or it's quite of a shock to them to come to a country such as the Philippines, which may have very different practices, very different ways of living from what they are accustomed to in their countries of origin. And local integration is one of the things that the Philippine government and UNHCR heavily advocates, no, as a durable solution for persons of concern, because in most situations, these individuals are unable to go back to their home countries because the situation is still unstable, or they risk their lives, they risk their freedom and enjoyment of their human rights if they return to their home countries. And we're also at a time now when the options for onward movement to a third country, for example, is very limited, or particularly these refugees, no, they come to the Philippines with essentially just the clothes on their backs and whatever savings they have, and they're not in a capacity, for example, to seek better opportunities in first world countries outside of the Philippines. So in those situations, no, when they don't have the option to move to a third country, or when they don't have the option to go back to their home countries, the local integration or cultural assimilation in the Philippines becomes more and more important in order for them to continue living dignified lives, to continue accessing the services that they need, and to continue engaging in activities, livelihood, education, whatever it may be, no, for them not just to provide for themselves, but for them to also effectively contribute to the communities. And this campaign also seeks to break down that misconception, no, that refugees become an added responsibility. In fact, if we look at it now from the perspective of, if we are able to provide enough opportunities or enough windows for these individuals to participate in the community, they could actually be an asset to the community, or they can bring something to the community. And we actually have a success story. Next slide, please. We have a success story that I am very proud to share with everybody. And in fact, this is a story that had taken at least 3-4 years to become what it is today. So back in 2017, we met with Malik. Came. Malik is actually both stateless and a refugee. He came from Palestine, was displaced to a refugee camp in Syria, and eventually found his way to the Philippines. So one of the issues that Malik had when he came to the Philippines is because he is a stateless person, he doesn't have any nationality, and also the fact that he was displaced from his country because of the ongoing war. He sought asylum in the Philippines together with his wife and 2 children. And one of the challenges that he was in the Philippines for about 10 years, and up till 2017 he was still having difficulties finding a job in the Philippines to support his wife and 2 children. And in 2017, that was when we started working with Malik, just to really assess, no, what were his needs, what were his challenges, what were the bottlenecks, or what support he really needed for him and his family to locally integrate in the Philippines, because he did say, no, that they didn't have enough money to provide for the continued education of his 2 very young children. And he also didn't have the option to go back to his home country, or did not have any means not to follow other relatives who were in other parts of the world, or in other countries outside of the Philippines. So his story is actually an example of the whole of society approach, because in that initial stage no, of getting to know more about Malik's background, what his educational background was, his work experience, his skills, this was the time we worked with San Beda College, and I know we have a representative from San Beda here. No, we worked with San Beda College in organizing career assessment exams. So there really was an exam, no, parang personality exam, and at the same time, no, through that personality exam, lalabas doon yung skills or strengths ng individual, kung leader type ba siya, kung yung type of work or nature of work ba niya was more of office or desk-based. So that kind of helped Malik no, identify what industry he was interested in terms of, for example, choosing a career, which helped him also no, narrow down yung job hunting opportunities niya. Because as you know, no, when we go job hunting, there are different industries that we can consider. And that was very useful for him no, in identifying what his interests were and then playing to his strengths in terms of where he saw himself succeeding or where he saw himself really engaging or contributing. Another activity that we had for Malik in relation to this no, was working with Santa Maria, Bulacan, who was one of the first cities to support this campaign. And at that time, no, they were really looking for an advocacy on how they can effectively make an impact to the lives of the refugee. So what we did no, is we really set up case management meetings where we brought in not just representatives from the LGU of Santa Maria, Bulacan, but we even had representatives from the DILG. We had representatives from the DOJ, RSPPU sit in those meetings. We also engaged the regional offices ng DSWD in terms of yung access to yung health, yung mga vaccinations or health services for his children. And we also had our NGO partner, the Community and Family Services International, yung social worker who was working directly with Malik, no, in terms of really getting everybody together and identifying how we all could work together to address yung issues that Malik was encountering that was hindering him from really contributing and really finding opportunities to support himself and his families. So one of the things no, through those consultation processes, one of the things that we were able to identify in terms of some of the concerns no, that he was struggling with was the documentation. We also partnered in the past with different companies. No, Malek was working with us and we partnered with companies such as San Miguel, with Starbucks, with Human Nature, and we were helping Malek no, send out his resumes to UNHCR's partner companies, but unfortunately, they also had difficulty moving forward with his job applications because he didn't have any records to prove his education back in his home country. That was one of the challenges. His certificate or college certificate was in Arabic, which he could not have translated, no, or he could not have authenticated to support his application as well. One of the challenges also was that these employers, no, although they wanted to take him in, the documentary requirements required by the HR procedures of companies were too stringent no, or too difficult for him to really meet or for him to be able to support no, his application. So yung mga transcript of records or school records niya, he no longer had the capacity to get those from his school back home. So parang out of the question na when we were in those consultation processes, no, parang yung employment with the private sector was already out of the question because the private sector also had certain requirements that they had to meet. So one of the things that we looked into, because commuting to Metro Manila was also one of the struggles no, that we had. We worked with Santa Maria, the LG of Santa Maria, in exploring what opportunities there were within that municipality, within the local government, that is more accessible to Malik because he also expressed no, that other than seeking engagement with the private sector or employment with the private sector, he also had dreams of setting up a shawarma business but didn't have enough capital. So we worked with the LGU and the different government agencies in identifying what opportunities are available to him so that he can save up enough money to eventually put up a shawarma business. And luckily, with the support of the LGU of Santa Maria, Bulacan, they eventually decided not to hire Malik as an employee in the Municipal Information Systems Unit because he did have experience in the past in working with computers, repairing computers, and even software programs such as Adobe Photoshop and Adobe Design and video editing applications, which the LGU needed also at that time. So they found an opportunity to engage Malik. It one of the limitations, however, given nga na parang his engagement with the LGU is parang contractual lang, the LGU is also limited no, within government policies to really regularize him because of the limitations in terms of his documents, in terms of what he can present. No, they agreed not to have Malik within parang a contract or within that agreement, no, for him to earn enough to get by naman din, no? To provide for the daily needs of his children, to send them to school, and for him to have enough savings also so that eventually, no, he and his family would have enough to put up, let's say, a more long-lasting business, which is what he wants naman din to achieve in the long run. And it was I would say a fruitful experience, a positive experience because dito mo makikita no yung support that came in both at the national level. You can see in the photo no nandyan si Yusek Dino ng DILG and even representatives no from the national offices ng DOJ and DILG down to the regional offices and representatives also from the LGU in really pooling all these resources together because other than the employment needs no there were also the welfare needs of the individual, yung ano yung makakain niya on a day-to-day basis, ano yung mga health concerns that his family was also facing at that time because they didn't have enough resources to provide for that. So that's where the whole of society plays that's where the whole society plays an important role in really meeting the everyday needs of an individual. Because it's important to note that when it comes to the protection of these persons of concern, it goes beyond their legal status in the Philippines. It's more than just legitimizing their stay in the country, but protection, more importantly, explains how these individuals are able rebuild their lives in their Philippines and how these individuals are able to continue accessing their basic rights and protective services in the way that other Filipinos are able to access rights and services of the government as well. So to show the story or to show a clip no, of the experience with Malik, there is a short video that I could share with everybody this morning.
Actually, I see myself after 5 years Filipino citizen.
There. Next slide, please. Yes. So to conclude, no, or just to close my presentation, I just have some key points that I wanted to leave with you with regard to the importance, no, of adopting a whole of nation approach. The first point is that it's important to recognize that there are rights attached to the status given to, for example, asylum seekers, refugees, stateless persons. Like I mentioned earlier, no, it's more than just a status that allows them to stay in the Philippines. When we talk about protection, no, it we talk about continued access to rights and services. We talk about durable solutions where individuals, no, are able to rebuild their lives in safety and dignity. So that's one point that I wanted to highlight. The second point, no, that I wanted to highlight is with regard to how we can work together, particularly when particularly, considering that the Philippines does not yet have a comprehensive law when it comes to the protection of persons of concern. We do have a favorable protection environment. We do have different legislation. We have different issuances that have bits and pieces of refugee and statelessness, protection of refugees and stateless persons embedded in their principles, but we don't have yet a comprehensive bill, no, that really allows for government agencies to fully extend the vast range of services and allocates, for example, specific resources for these persons of concern. So in that sense, no, apart from advocating at the policy or legislative level, it's also important to look into how in the meantime, no, we can address the gaps that we have in our current or existing framework. Because when we talk about legislation, no, we anticipate that it would take time for legislation to pass, and it would take time for it to really start rolling out and for it to really have a system in terms of implementation. But the needs of persons of concern is ongoing, no? Parang everyday, how do you phrase it? Every day, hindi nagbabago yung need for assistance ng mga persons of concern natin. So it's important, no, that apart from the national government aspect, no, or apart from the policy aspect, it's important na host communities, host countries, and yung mga everyday people, no, we're talking about academe, civil society organizations, and even faith-based organizations, we all pitch in because isipin nyo na lang na, for example, if somebody provides shelter here, a scholarship activity here, subsistence allowance here, when you put that all together, no, it provides a framework that comprehensively addresses the needs of our persons of concern. And what we wanted to highlight, no, is that no matter how small the contribution, no, of the different sectors of society, it contributes to the overall protection framework, which is exactly what our persons of concern need. So that's another point that I wanted to emphasize. And hopefully, no, through this webinar and through the discussions that we will have, hopefully, no, this experience, not just of Malek, but also the good practices and positive statements, no, from local governments will help you, no, look into how in your own ways how your individual contributions or even contributions of your agencies or offices could really support, no, or strengthen inclusive policies and societies that would allow for our persons of concern to rebuild their lives in safety and dignity and allow them not to continue enjoying their basic rights here in the Philippines. So that concludes my presentation for this morning, and I hope you found this information useful and looking forward to hearing more from the discussions.